Okay, so the first talk is going to be modeling the supply chain, trust and verifying complex systems. It's going to be presented by Craig Sheldon, and he is from Capital Technology University in Laurel.
Thank you. To let y'all know, I am recording this, and if I can get the editing to work out and it works out okay, I'll be posting it on either YouTube or Vimeo. For that reason, I would suggest if we have any discussion and questions that you not identify yourself unless you particularly want to be identified in the video. Because the camera's aimed here, we're seeing what's up on the screen and me, and that's it. The genesis of this report is from the University of New South Wales, their Canberra campus that's in association with the Australian Defence Force Academy. Primary author Teresa Saab was in the master's program there, and Benjamin Turnbull was her academic advisor in the program. Shar Sample was working with Teresa on this and wanted a more experienced system engineer as part of the team, so I was recruited to help out with that. I've got a background in cybersecurity, systems engineering, and actually in supply chain risk management also, so it was a very nice fit. As we move into the story that we want to tell, let's go to the next slide. This is just to remind folks of what's going on with supply chain. Supply chain is the core concept of the logistics world. And on one side of the slide, you see just some reminders, including one typo I'll admit to, on major operations in kinetic warfare where the world of logistics was critical to success and failure. And in all of those cases, we were looking at traditional kinetic attack on supply chain and defense. And remember, historically, supply chain needed to be protected against and would be attacked by the features of theft or damage of the items being delivered, or impeding the ability of the supply chain to produce or transport. The digital age has added a new feature to that, which is we can now look at compromising the supply chain, either the data systems that support the movement of objects or the objects themselves. Very important to know about this. For the traditional kinetic attack of impede, damage, or steal, you know if you've been hit. Today in the digital world, if it's compromised, you may not know unless you're doing something about keeping track of that. When my first work with supply chain risk management was with the U.S. Defense Department under the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity stricture, which was at that time classified, and we had to keep reminding people, once upon a time, the threat of supply chain risk was risk to the supply chain. Now, with the digital world cybersecurity, it's a risk through the supply chain to the organizations and missions at the end of the operation. So that's the approach that we need to think of when we talk supply chain risk, supply chain security in the digital world. For those who don't know World War II history, Dwight Eisenhower in 1930-1940 was a lieutenant colonel logistics officer in the U.S. Army. He rose to Supreme Allied Commander, 5-star general, because of his knowledge and ability to take advantage of the logistics processes throughout the war. And one of his most frustrating operational combat generals was George Patton. If you've seen the movie, what doesn't show up in there is the fact that his drive across Europe, the key aspect of that was making sure the fuel trucks could keep up with his armor. So again, traditional supply chain key to warfare, and just as much so in today's world, whether we're looking at pre-warfare, like Lee will talk about, or actual warfare of where we go. So we go to the next slide. This is just a reminder of, one, the terminology we're dealing with. Supply chains can be simple. I pick apples and I get them to the market. They can be complicated. I am building a car and I've got parts coming from a lot of different organizations that each build it, old-fashioned cars, let's not talk about today, but they're coming forward, and there's a whole lot of pieces, a lot of suppliers, a lot of transport systems, some in-house, some contracted. And then we work to the world of complexity. And I will confess that at my knowledge level and experience, I consider complicated and complex the same thing. Turns out they're not. The complexity has another level of consideration, and that's what we get into as we look at supply chains taking a systems engineering approach and looking at the aspects of trust and the complexity model itself. So this is just to remind folks of how messy it gets with digital systems, hardware, software, embedded software. You see on the software you've got it coming at different levels. Some of it come already embedded on your component parts coming from multiple suppliers. The application software, and you may be building your own BIOS and program EEPROM software. You've got in-house developers. They license modules from other companies, and both your in-house and your license probably go out and use some open source libraries. How do you know where those came from? So let's talk a little bit more about complexity. We can go to the next slide. Two statements on the left of the slide give you an understanding of the approach taken to what is considered complex. Short version is the way I understand it from my reading as we prepared this paper. Complex means if something happens in the middle of your system, you may not be able to predict the result. In a complicated system, you can at least know, all right, this supplier or this transporter failed, and here's what trickles down through the system. But in a complex system, you may not be able to predict the end result. And this is where it becomes important in digital, where we're looking at compromise of our systems. Compromise induced through the supply chain. The other aspect we see is there's a couple of different references. And by the way, the references to tables and figures here are the items that are in the paper itself. So if you go into the full proceedings, you'll be able to see the information built out a little bit more. So we've got all of the traits of complexity, nonlinearity. Like I said, even a complicated supply chain, something fails here, you can see the trickle down what's going to happen. In a complex supply chain, an item is compromised 3 or 4 levels and 2 or 3 suppliers back. It may have totally unexpected, unintended consequences in your operational capability that even the agent who developed the compromise could not have predicted. So that's what we're looking at. The complex systems do tend to look for their own order, that they order themselves, and the feedback will come back when it can. I recommend that you open the paper and look at the discussions of these 7 traits, because it kind of gets a little deeper than we need to go into in here, other than making you aware of where we're going. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at those 7 traits and what happens in our supply chains. Oh, another typo, I did it again. The nonlinearity is the biggie. A link disruption, whether it's a change in the product or a diversion or such, it may have an exponential impact, especially if that piece is affecting others that were brought in parallel to it in your complicated supply chain, but the complexity goes forward. One of the big problems in digital systems is people keep changing their minds about what they want the system to do. There's your stakeholders change their requirements. So we're looking at what happens there for the evolving requirements. And what does that do if the new requirement has to be implemented 4, 5, 6 layers back in your supply chain? What happens to you when that's going on? The decentralized control, well, clearly we've got that going on in traditional complicated digital manufacturing, where you've got multiple suppliers, multiple developers, all contributing to the final product. The robustness an issue of, if you see something go wrong, can you limit the impact? So that trait needs to be looked at when you're examining your supply chain, seeing how complex it is. And most, like I said, most digital supply chains, when you really map them out, they are going to be complex, more so than simply complicated. The data congregation that happens as you're putting together your information about all of the component pieces of the supply chain, who they are, who's producing, who are their backside suppliers, which is part of your supply chain, then the data as it comes together, that gives you a narrative about what your overall product is experiencing as you're developing it and bringing it to the final user. The hierarchical organization, this gets into the impact of those multiple separate financial entities, especially who's making a profit where and why. And if you change something over here, what does that do to the profit levels of the company and the economy in their nation? That can come in to hit you also. Finally, the numerosity, if you just count the number of pieces and the number of interrelationships, then that level of complexity will hit you in a complex system. So let's go to the next slide, please. And now we got to talk about trust. And I need to make a notation. The primary author uses the word trust in this paper that personally I would substitute trustworthy. We issue trust for any transaction, any product, based upon a combination of reputation, testing, expectation. The real issue is whether or not the component pieces and your total supply chain are worthy of that trust. So when I read the paper, I in my mind substitute trustworthy for trust, because you'll see statements in there about a loss of trust and what that does to your system, to your supply chain treated as a system. Well, the loss of trust may come from a perception that does not have adequate basis. So it may still be trustworthy, but you don't think it is. That's going to affect how you run your system and how you use your supply chain. But if you think in terms of trustworthiness, does it really deserve to be trusted? Then that little language shift, I think, will help you as you look at the details of the paper. Now, what we've done is look at the 7 traits and how they interrelate with the 3 frameworks we use for system engineering. I will use the top-level, high-view systems engineering approach that the system, and I will remind double E's and comp sci people here, what you call a computer system is not a system according to system engineers. Because you talk about hardware and software and call that a system. It's not a system under system engineering principles and processes. System is the hardware tools that you use, the hardware tools, the processes followed to use those, and the people who are involved in following those processes. So that high view allows you to set the total components of what a systems engineer will call a system. So with that, the system engineering, we're looking at the decentralized control where in a complex supply chain treated as a system, I as the end purchaser user do not have control over the hiring processes, the knowledge, skills, and abilities of people working at my component suppliers and their subcontractors, upchain suppliers. So I can't control it. I can say what I want, what I'm looking for, but I've lost control there, so I have to have other ways to get confirmation that they are trustworthy. The idea that it's a breach of contract to give me what I didn't ask for, that has legal ramifications, and we actually have some discussion on that aspect in the paper by reference a talk last fall at ISSA by a lawyer who has been looking at the legal and contractual issues of supply chain, which is an important part of your controls and inspection mechanisms. So then the other, of course, is the emergence of new things happen. Your supplier gives you a great new chip that does wonderful new things. In addition to what you wanted to happen, they've gotten capabilities in there that maybe they added another radio. Think about cell phones today. Have you counted how many different radios are in a device that big? You've got the 3G comm system. You've got the 4G comm system. We have emerging 5G comm systems just for the telephone capability itself. You've got near-field communications, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth. Now, you may be able to get a chip with all of those on one chip, but that's a handful of radios. That's just one example of a new feature. I've got that example here right now. I'm using an older model GoPro, which I have to use Wi-Fi to control. The newer models give you the option of Bluetooth. When I opened the GoPro app, it said, connect by Bluetooth. That one doesn't have Bluetooth. New feature, new capability. So this happens all the time in the digital world. For the dependency modeling, you may not know in a complex supply chain that one of your suppliers also depends upon product and work at a parallel supplier. You know that they depend upon work happening farther back in the chain of what they do, but they may have parallel relationships also. The spontaneous ordering is going to happen if you can track all of the bits and pieces of your hardware and software coming through. Now let's talk about people for a minute. One thing that a lot of people don't think about, your supply chain includes very often pieces of maintenance and support ongoing. Who are they sending? What are their capabilities? So you get into that. Then we get into the trust engineering where we need the feedback. Is it trustworthy? Is it a true hierarchical organization? Can you figure out who's where in the relationships? And again, the complexity. Let's go to the next slide. Our conclusions, that main ones, we've got a few more described in the paper, are you've got to be careful. If you describe your supply chain in vague generalities, you're not going to have enough information to be sure you're talking about complicated versus complex. And you also definitely will not have enough information to start looking at how you can protect yourself from the possibilities of what's happening in the supply chain. Again, I've said this a couple times, you're most likely in a deep digital world to have a complex supply chain and need to be thinking about these. And what we really look at is disruption by theft, impeding the supply, or damaging, you're going to know about. It may still damage your mission, but what happens? What happens if the compromise you didn't know about, and what happens to your mission there? We completed this paper late summer, did our revisions in the fall, and I'd like to just show you as one last item. After submission and exception, if you go to the last slide, please, the Government Accountability Office released this report specifically addressing the very problems of contractual relationships in the supply chain and what you can do, what government operations need to look at. So if you are interested in following this, I would recommend pulling that paper down. It's free. GAO reports are very valuable in terms of information that they have developed. I'm open for questions. We've got a couple minutes before we need to move to the next speaker. Any comments, questions? Jenny?
Trust but verify. I've always had problems with this because they're contradictory. And if we're verifying, that means we don't trust. And I've written papers on trust in
Yes.
organizations, and it means different things to different people. So that whole concept alone requires, further examination. And the other, and it's an excellent presentation, so thank you. The other, the contract clarification piece of this is getting so complicated with everybody using different terminologies. And I find quite often we're not enforcing the contracts. Therefore, we're letting things slip by and we're not developing strong meanings of what we're trying to say and what we expect in our contract.
Thank you. I just learned last night that besides the expertise that we know Jenny for here, she's also had legal training and practice law, and so her comments on the contract are quite cogent. The presentation that Mr. Saab gave at ISSA last fall that we cited, I sat in the presentation, asked him if he would give me the slides so we could use that. You're right. Contracts that do not have quality cross-checks and enforcement are worthless. Sadly, in the world of government contracting, that happens a lot because the office responsible either doesn't know how to put those in or it doesn't have the resources to follow up with the cross-checks. The trust but verify, people have heard that since the Reagan years, and what that means is exactly what Jenny said. I don't really trust you, so prove to me you are trustworthy on what you told me. I've been called out on forums online when I ask somebody to tell me, well, where did you get that fact? What's the citation? Well, it's your responsibility to look it up. No, it's not. If you make the claim, it's your responsibility to tell me why you're making the claim. Anything else? Thank you.